Hey, do you have to deal with CBAM? Then this podcast episode is going to be super interesting to you. I'm going to talk with Marius Sprenger, who is an absolute expert in CBAM and already consulting companies regarding this topic. So if you were wondering what CBAM is about, what deadlines have already passed, and what milestones still lie ahead for CBAM, then you should definitely listen to this episode. Enjoy. Hello, Marius. Thank you so much for taking the time. For those of the listeners that don't know you yet, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What are you doing right now and how did you get here?
Yes, of course. Hi, Daniel. Thank you for the invitation. I'm Marius, and I am building a company called kolum.earth together with my co-founder, Helge. And it's a company that focuses on carbon pricing regulations in international trade. And of course, we are starting with the European CBAM, so the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism that has been in place since October last year with a transitional phase. And we are building software that allows companies to comply with those regulations and then also optimize on their carbon costs. How did I get here? Yeah, please.
I was about to say, it sounds super interesting, but also I would say that this is not the easiest topic. So then the question would be, how did you get here and why did you choose that topic?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Supply chain is tricky, but still a super interesting topic for me. My co-founder Helge is actually the one that approached me with the topic. So he studied law and he has been writing his PhD thesis on the CBAM for the last 3 years. So looking at it from a very theoretical lens, I would say. But then early last year, he started to give training courses for affected companies. And he kind of sat down with them in a monthly webinar and walked them through. So what is coming with CBAM? What are the requirements for you? How is it also going to evolve? And then what emerged from those webinars was that companies are actually looking for a solution that allows them to comply, that takes the complexity out of it. And they were actively asking, is there a software? And he was always saying, well, not yet. And then he kind of called me, and I was in between things and was looking to build something in the climate space. And then we looked at a topic and I was hooked immediately, and we started brainstorming how could a first software solution look like that we always call it a fire extinguisher that kind of solves the immediate need of companies. But then also how can we look at the topic from a global perspective? How can we think it long term? And then we, with a small team, we built a prototype over the last 6 months, I would say, to help companies in the first reporting period. And then we are now assembling another small team to build this holistic software, so to call. And that's what we are doing and what keeps us busy.
Interesting. Have you done things with sustainability in the past, or is this the first project of yours that is related to sustainability?
It's actually my first, let's call it full-time project. I wrote my PhD thesis at the University of Münster, and the chair I was writing my thesis on also had a very advanced sustainability research area, and I was involved from time to time there, and we got a lot of insights. But the first actual this is my first actual sustainability project, and it's very rewarding so far, and we'll see where it gets me.
Okay, and so you're developing software for CBAM with kolum.earth, if I understood correctly. What is your current situation like? What stage are you in? What are you working on right now?
So we are in the early stage possible, I would say. We built a prototype that kind of helped companies for their first reporting deadline in January. So it allowed them to kind of track their imports, manage their manufacturers, and using the default emission values provided by the European Commission, create a compliant report. And that report is not a simple PDF file. It's a rather complex XML file where everything has to be in place, and the software kind of generated that report. And that was the prototype that we used to see if there was traction on the topic, if there is a need for the product that we envision. For us, the clear answer was yes, there is. So we took a lot of learnings from that prototype, and now we are building kind of from scratch the holistic software version that we have been envisioning for the last year, I would say. So that's the stage we are currently in.
Okay. I think we already dove a little bit into the CBAM topic, but maybe for those people that are not that familiar, that have heard about CBAM but don't really know what exactly is it about, can you just paint a picture of what is CBAM and who is it affecting? What is it doing right now?
Yes, of course. So CBAM is a regulation by the European Commission. CBAM stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And it's a sustainability regulation that requires companies that import specific goods inside the European Union to track the emissions that are embedded in their imports, so that occur throughout their supply chain at the manufacturers that produce those goods. We are now in a transitional phase that lasts until end of next year, where companies need to submit a quarterly report that kind of demonstrate the emissions of their imports. And then from 2026 onwards, CBAM evolves even further, and then there comes a cost factor into it, meaning that based on your emissions, you as a company need to buy so-called CBAM certificates, which is kind of exciting because for the first time, there's actually a direct cost associated with emissions throughout your supply chain, meaning that companies are actually incentivized to focus on lower emission imports, and also third country producers are incentivized to produce greener. And so what we see is an interesting shift, hopefully, that kind of prioritizes and incentivizes less emission heavy imports and production methods.
Okay, yeah, sounds super good. How do companies know that they are affected by CBAM? Who's affected? And what if companies are not entirely sure? Is there some place to look up whether you're affected or not?
Yes, so there is a fixed list of CBAM affected goods, or CN codes is the specific customs terminology. And so basically, whenever you are a company that imports those goods from outside the EU into the EU, you are affected. And that is different compared to other sustainability regulations where you, for example, it only applies to you from a certain company size or from a certain revenue size on. That is different with CBAM. So any company that, let's say imports like 10 screws worth than more than 150 euros is affected by this in the same way as a major automotive supplier would be affected. And that is also why we see many companies struggling with this, that are, for example, super small and don't have the capacities to actually comply with this. And that's what makes CBAM on a theoretical level very, very effective. But on a practical level, it comes with a lot of challenges for companies, and not everyone is happy about it for good reason. But that's why we are, of course, building hopefully intuitive technology.
Yeah, no, I can completely imagine, and I get the idea that if we start to have more sustainability regulations in the EU, and we really ask a lot from the companies here, and also make it a little bit more difficult for companies in Europe to work because of sustainability measures, that we also need measures that protect somewhat the European market and also somehow apply some more rules and regulations onto the markets outside of Europe. So I get the idea, and I think it's a really good idea. But yeah, again, it comes with a lot of bureaucracy and therefore challenges.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe the challenges is a good point. What are challenges that you see in the market that companies are struggling with, or that a lot of companies have to deal with right now?
Yeah, I mean, so a clear insight or learning from the first reporting period was that there's a clear lack of knowledge in many companies. So a lot of companies didn't even know they were affected. So communication by the European Commission was a bit, well, let's say not that existent. So it first took some time for companies to know, okay, I'm affected by this, I need to submit a report. And then to actually understand how to create this report, what has to be included, where do I need to submit it, in what form, that was a major challenge for many organizations. And of course, the bigger ones, they could just outsource this to consultancies who put money on the topic, but that wasn't an option for many smaller organizations that simply couldn't afford this and had to put a full-time team on this. So that was a challenge that we saw in January. And then there were also major troubles with the, let's call it the IT portal by the European Commissions, because that is the central place to submit your report. And given that CBAM was kind of put in place rather quick, so it was decided in May last year, and then the transition phase started in October last year. So there was not a lot of time to prepare for companies, but also not a lot of time apparently for the Commission to create a functioning IT portal. So there was a lot of downtime, a lot of error messages, and this led to major frustration for the companies because at first they didn't know how to create the report, and then second, they weren't able to submit it. So those were the major challenges from the first reporting deadline, I would say. But if you think further, how is CBAM going to evolve? Then the next major milestone comes in August this year, because from there on, companies need actual emission data directly from their producers. So for now, they can use default emission values that are provided by the European Commission, but those are not acceptable anymore from August onwards. So they need to go back to the root of their supply chain and really get the emission data from the source, which, if you look at practice and how things work, is sometimes really, really difficult, because in many cases you have multiple suppliers throughout your supply chain, so you don't purchase directly from the producer. And second of all, actually calculating and gathering that emission data is complex, because third country producers in many cases don't have that data yet, and they are kind of a little bit lost when it comes to calculating it. And to be frank, the European Commission provides a rather complex Excel template that is, let's say, hard to use in practice. So that is something that we hear from companies a lot, that they simply don't know how to get that emission data that is required for them from August onwards. I think that's the immediate feedback that we get right now.
Yeah, you touched on 3 different points, and I would like to dive deeper into them separately. Let's start with the one that you touched on last. So I completely understand if the European Commission has some certain emission data and basically tells like, hey, for your input, you calculate with those emission data. But from August 1st, if I understood correctly, companies need to calculate the actual emission factor that the product emits, right?
Correct.
Okay. So how can companies go on with that? Because I feel like this is like, yeah, in theory, you just need to find the right emission data, but how do you approach that? How do you get your suppliers to give you the emissions data? How do you know yourself, like which emission data you actually know? Is there like a process for that? Or when you work with products, like how can companies approach that are maybe now in the process and they're completely overwhelmed because they don't know where to do the first step?
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest challenge we hear, because as I said, it's complicated because you have multiple suppliers in between in many cases, but what you need is the root of your supply chain, and it's actually there are specific CBAM calculation formulas provided by the European Commission. So basically, a Commission-approved way of calculating your emissions. And in theory, this is what the producers in the third country need to use to calculate and gather their emission data, and then they would need to send that back to the European importers, so the European companies, which sounds okay in theory, but of course in practice it's rather complex. And what we always tell organizations is you need to start approaching your suppliers and your producers. You need to kind of get them warmed up. You need to talk to them. Okay, these emission data, this is coming. You will need to provide that because this is actually for us required to act compliant and to be able to continue to import those goods from you. So I think communication is key, as easy as it may sound. So companies really need to start approaching their suppliers and manufacturers. And then, there's a lot of from the outside, there's a lot of complexity in those calculation formulas. But if you kind of break it down step by step, it is solvable. And I think it's just important for companies to understand those formulas and to kind of give guidance to the suppliers in calculating that emission data. I think that is key. And that is also what this transitional phase is for right now. Basically, it is the European Commission's way of generating more accurate emission data. So basically understanding which good produces which kinds of emissions. And then those more accurate emission data will be used to develop new default values. So it's a very complicated process, but long story short, companies should start reaching out to their suppliers and kind of preparing them for this CBAM calculation method.
Okay. The second point I wanted to ask about is a little bit about the timeline. So you mentioned the first reporting period. You mentioned August 1st, that is also a key date. And then maybe a little bit long term to 2026. So can you just explain a little bit how the timeline of CBAM develops, what is already past us and what milestones still lie ahead for CBAM?
Yeah, for sure. So CBAM was, it's called phased in October last year, so 1st of October 2023. And companies had to submit their first CBAM report end of January this year for the quarter 4 of 2023. And these quarterly reports is the status quo for the next 2 years. So each quarter, companies need to submit their so-called CBAM report. And from October last year onwards, they can and could and can use the default emission values. So basically, it's as you said earlier. So they import specific goods. That specific good has a default emission value. So let's say you import 10 tons of a steel product. So you just use that emission value and multiply by 10, and then you are done for this quarter. And this will change in August onwards, from August onwards, because then you cannot use the default emission values anymore. You need the actual CBAM calculation method that kind of then gives you the emission data, and you need to use that for your quarterly CBAM report. Until end of this year, there's still some percentage of default emission values that you can use, but from January onwards 2025, only 100% the CBAM emission data is allowed. So it really is crucial now to get the data from your manufacturers. And then in 2025, companies need to kind of apply for the status of CBAM declarant, because this is an official import status that they need to continue importing their goods from 2026 onwards. It's crucial now to comply with the regulation and to submit your quarterly CBAM reports, because if you don't, this status might not be given to you, and which means you might be prevented from importing your goods from 2026 onwards. And that is when the CBAM certificate trade comes into play. So based on your emissions, you then need to buy CBAM certificates, and this is why it is quite important for companies to now get that actual emission data, because the actual emission data will be much, much cheaper than the default emission values from 2026 onwards. So this is something I forgot to mention. companies now need actual emission data from August onwards, but from 2026 onwards, they can again, it's rather confusing, but they can again use the default emission values. But they will have a clear markup, meaning that they will, or buying certificates based on those emission values, default emission values, will be super expensive. And you have a clear incentive to actually use the actual emission data. And that's when the certificate trade comes into play. And that's when also this cost factor, of course, comes into play for companies. And then, things will evolve from there. But I think that's a detailed first overview for the next 2 years.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very good overview to like understand a little bit and get where CBAM is developing. So you touched on the how to call them, the credits that companies need to buy for their emissions. So basically, can I say compensate? Is that the right word for it?
Yeah, I think we can use that.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit more about those credits that companies have to or can buy? I know that the EU is always a little bit slow and a little bit complicated in like releasing information about that. So, but is there already some information on those out, and how does that look like? What should companies calculate with or expect?
What we know so far is that it will come in 2026, but the specific information on how the certificate trade will be organized comes in October this year, or in Q4 this year. So this is when we have specific information on how it will go down. But on a very general level, companies can already prepare. So basically you need to buy one certificate for each ton of emission embedded in your imports. So let's say you have 100 tons embedded in your imports, then you need to buy 100 certificates. Like in a nutshell, or this is like a thumb rule. And pricing wise, it's hard to say. So you have of course, the European trading scheme. So what we expect is that the prices for one certificate will be somewhere between 80 and 200 euros, but with a tendency of an increase. So companies that we talk to already start calculating, okay, I have that many imports and that many import emissions. This will result in that cost factor. If I had the actual emission values, that would be maybe half of the default emission values. This would result in a X% cost reduction. So this is what we know. Of course, specific numbers are hard to tell, but this is what we kind of calculate internally with. And what we also know for sure is that when your producer, I'm making things even more complicated now, but when your producer that you're importing from has already paid a national carbon price. So for example, there are some countries that already have a national emission trading scheme. If they already paid for the production of their goods there, they can provide that information to you as a European company, and you can deduct that from your own CBAM certificate requirements. And this is also a very interesting effect of CBAM, because you have this fragmented ecosystem of national and regional emission systems that somehow need to be harmonized. And yeah, it's going to be super interesting to see how this is going to evolve. But what companies can take away is that it will be super beneficial to have actual data from the third country, emission data, as well as potentially already paid carbon prices, because then your CBAM certificate prices will be much, much lower. And yeah, as I said, from October onwards, we have more clarity on how it's actually going to look like, where you can buy and sell those certificates. And of course, we will then give a major update on our platform as well.
Yeah, I would be super curious to see how this develops and how this fits into the existing carbon credit trading schemes that are out there from the EU. And yeah, I completely get that this is difficult to coordinate within the EU, but especially then if you work with different systems from different countries. I see how this is not an easy task to manage. Another challenge that you already mentioned and that I would like to ask about a little bit more, because I already talked to companies that were complaining about this, so I'm curious to learn more, like the EU portal for the CBAM. Can you tell us a little bit more about the portal itself and about the challenges? So the thing that I got so far is that companies at the end need to report on their CBAM measures within this EU portal, right?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, there is a central platform provided by the European Commission, and companies get access through their national institution. In Germany, it works via the customs or Zoll, but it's a central platform, and you have an area where you can kind of create your CBAM report. And the problem that we heard from many companies was that it's hard to use. So what you need to do is you need to enter everything manually if you work directly in the portal. So basically for every CN code, you need to manually add how much you imported, when that was, so in which quarter, of course, and how many emissions occurred or were embedded, which it's doable if you have like 10 imports per quarter. But if you talk to the larger organizations that have 10,000 imports per quarter, of course, not very feasible. And then, so a rather complex user experience, I would say. Hopefully this will get better over time. And this was combined with major technical challenges. So during the day in January, there was a lot of overload on those servers, and it was hard to get in or to refresh the page. Then there were major error messages, which were hard to understand, which then had to be fixed. So what we took away was that there was a lot of frustration on the company side, and they were just saying, this is not an option for the long term unless it gets drastically better, which we hope it will. But yeah, for now, it's a rather frustrating experience, I would say.
Okay. Yeah. I think I asked enough about challenges because I know there are plenty of challenges and problems ahead. Do you have any tips and recommendation to maybe get a little bit more to the positive side of CBAM that could be helpful or that are practical for companies that are in the whole CBAM process and that are just trying to get along and maybe trying to improve the situation a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked a lot about frustration, but of course, we are also building this company because we see the upside of this regulation and also other regulations, because it is effective in lowering global CO2 emissions, and other countries are incentivized to publish their own regulations, and this can lead to a so-called climate club where you have different national regulations that all incentivize lower emission production methods, and this is quite exciting, actually. And of course, it's easy for me to say because I do not need to submit a CBAM report. I can just talk nicely all day. But I think this is really is a chance also for organizations to kind of look through their supply chain, to get transparency throughout their supply chain, potentially say, okay, I'm importing this good, but my producer produces very emission heavy. But there might be this other producer that produces in a very green way, which is good for environment, but also good for me from a cost perspective, because I would then need to buy fewer CBAM certificates. So we see this really as a chance for organizations to kind of reevaluate their supply chain, reevaluate who am I purchasing from, and then focus on producers that produce less emission heavy. And yeah, so in order to achieve this, it will take a few years. Transparency throughout the supply chain is always a nice buzzword, which takes major data collection and lots of technology and lots of effort by everyone involved. But this is always something that we talk about and that we really like about CBAM, that this is a really chance to get that transparency over time.
Yeah, no, I also truly believe that this is like a step into the right direction and that it can be really helpful. Companies just need to be able to cope with it and comply with it. Do you have any recommendations for companies so this can get easier, or what would you recommend a company that has to do CBAM so that they make their life a little bit easier? Or
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make this a sales pitch, but I think that a good intuitive software or technology support is crucial, because what we see now is that you have like a CBAM task force internally, and you have like 4 to 5 people working on it, taking lots of time and resources, which I mean, I completely understand, because this is a way to achieve immediate compliance. But I think I would recommend to look for software support, to kind of look, where can I streamline processes? Where can I automate my import classification, automate my report creation and submission? It doesn't have to be us. We would be glad. But in general, I think that this is what I would recommend to companies, to kind of look at the market, which software maybe fits to my needs. Where do I have a good feeling? What can I still do manually? What is a process that might be automated? And then I think that a lot of interesting companies emerge right now that offer such a service. I mean, you provided an extensive list. I would just recommend to screen through that and kind of look at companies that offer such a service, and then kind of start optimizing the internal processes. Start kind of looking, where can I automate things? And then I think this is an interesting challenge that can be solved over the next years. But doing everything manually, and I don't think that is a feasible thing for companies to do. So there should be a technology support, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I just thinking about like doing all of this manually and like putting it into the system and like having to do it over and over and over again. I would definitely try to look for a way to automate that, just to save time and to actually, I think CBAM is a very good thing, but only if we like automate it and don't lose too much time on all the bureaucracy and all that stuff, but we actually like get things done. But another question I also get asked quite often is for free material or some helpful insights, or I don't want to say cheat codes because we don't want to do it the right way, but companies are always looking for like helpful things. Do you know, or do you have any free material, or do you know where companies can find such information that can just help them along the way a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we on our website, I think we provide extensive material on the milestones of CBAM, but also maybe some background information. And what we see a lot in the market is free webinars, actually. So we are going to offer some free webinars over the next weeks and months. But of course, also other companies are doing this, that are working in a similar space. So this is what I would really recommend to companies, to kind of look for a webinar. Usually there's also like a local authority that offers such things. In Germany, you have the IHK or other other authorities. So I would recommend companies to kind of get involved in those authorities, kind of look, where can I get webinars? Please write us, because we're going to offer some. But if you feel more comfortable with another company or authority, please do that as well. This is, I think, there's a lot of helpful material out there for companies that they can get involved with.
Yeah, maybe you can send me a link to the material on your website afterwards, so I can put it into the show notes, so that companies, if they want to check it out, they can check it there, or check out one of the other companies that also do something there, and they can also probably find some helpful information there.
Yes, of course.
Perfect. I have one last question. So for companies that are listening right now and that also have to deal with CBAM, and tomorrow they like go into a meeting about this specific topic, what is the one thing that they should remember about our conversation and about what you just talked about CBAM? Is there like a clear specific thing you would recommend that is important?
Yes. I think preparation is key. I think and there is good support on the sidelines, but it actually has to become a priority in organizations. It shouldn't be a thing that is just annoying on the sidelines. It should be taken seriously, and companies should kind of start their internal processes on how do I deal with it. Because to be fair, it's only going to get more complex over time. So I think really sitting down now and thinking that in the long term, how is it going to evolve? How do I want to address this as a company? Where can I get software support? Where can I get manual support? What can I do internally? This is what I would recommend organizations. And then maybe also kind of lose the frustration, because this regulation is not going to go away. Companies will have to comply with it, and there is no point in just always being angry about it. I completely understand it, but I think kind of accepting it as something that will come over time and on a global level will hopefully make things better. Of course, I know this doesn't help you as a small company, but kind of accepting it and kind of putting the processes into place that will help solve it for you. I think that is going to be key over the next month, and this is what I would recommend to all companies.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marius, for all your insights and for taking the time to talk to CBAM, talk to me about CBAM. That I think for me it was really helpful to just get everything in place and know a little bit better about the overview. So yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for the invitation, Daniel.